Welcome to today's Postgres conference webinar, Building Open Source Teams. We're joined by Bruce Momjian, co-founder and core team member of the PostSQL Global Development Group, who will highlight the challenges of building and managing an open source team of volunteers. My name is Lindsay Hooper. I'm one of the Postgres conference organizers, and I'll be your moderator for this webinar. A little bit about your speaker. Bruce has worked on Postgres since 1996 and has worked at Enterprise DB since 2006. He's spoken at many international open source conferences and is the author of PostgreSQL, Introduction and Concepts, published by Addison Wesley. Prior to his involvement with Postgres, Bruce worked as a consultant developing custom database applications for some of the world's largest law firms. As an academic, Bruce holds a master's in education, was a high school computer science teacher, which I think is really cool, and lectures internationally. So welcome to Bruce. So with that, I'm going to hand it off. Take it away.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Good to be talking to you today. I know we're all kind of still adjusting to the the lockdown or not lockdown, depending on what part of the world you're in. I can say I received 4 event invitations for the fall just in the past 2 weeks. So things are definitely stirring in the Postgres world in terms of events and activities. Some of my fall things are online, Israel, I think, and I think Israel is my biggest online one, but then there's 3 potential in Russia. There's a hybrid one in Raleigh, and a couple more. I'm not remembering all of them. I think I'm doing one for you, Lindsay. I think in August as well, but that's also a webinar. So things are kind of getting back to active. But again, it's going to be kind of different depending on what region you're in. I was just talking to the Japanese and Asian guys this week about maybe doing an event there in the fall, if depending on what country we choose and how things play out with vaccination. So anyway, it's an interesting time, but it's wonderful to be speaking today. I am Bruce Momjian. Thank you for the introduction. I have been involved with Postgres since 1996, but my open source involvement goes back even further. I think I started in 91 or 90, probably 91 was probably the first open source thing I did. And I've obviously seen it go up and down. I remember when I used to have to explain to people what email was. That was interesting. I used to explain what Usenet was, which many of you probably don't know what that is. And I had an email server very early, and sort of worked up with basically doing open source and seeing what worked, what didn't, what things didn't work right. In fact, when I started in 1996, the Postgres code had just come out of Berkeley, and I could see some things that weren't going well, some missed opportunities. And one of the reasons I got involved with Postgres was I felt that it had potential, but it needed management. It needed somebody to help steer it a little better, and to sort of bring people together and focus their energies. And effectively, that's the sort of theme of this talk is that managing open source teams is basically focusing energy. Some groups do it really well. Unfortunately, some open source groups do it very poorly. And I'm probably not going to go into them. I'm not going to name those too much. But be that as it may, not all open source teams are managed in the same way. And some of them are much less effective than others. Postgres is probably one of the sort of the shining examples of a real good, well-managed open source project. And in fact, when I gave a talk in I guess it was Singapore, online a couple months ago, one of the people said, "Why can't all projects be managed like Postgres?" I'm like, I don't know. This is the only one I'm involved with, but there are challenges to all of this, and we're going to kind of go over some. We're going to kind of dive into some of the specifics of exactly what makes things work and what makes things don't work. We only have 16 slides, so it's not going to be a huge slide-heavy presentation, but it is going to have a lot of thoughts, a lot of analysis and stories about what things have worked well, and what things haven't worked well, and sort of how you sort of figure that, because nobody really comes and learns how to run an open source team from a book or from from a from going to college or whatever. Usually it's sort of something that you kind of learn as you go. In fact, right now I'm going to show you a book just because I mentioned books. I'm going to get one. Not every day that I take my headset off and grab something from my bookcase, but this is kind of a nice book. It's a couple years old. In fact, a number of years old. It's by Bernard Golden. It's probably the best book I've seen in terms of how open source works and sort of how the projects work. Yeah, this is pretty old. I have met the author, and I was really impressed by the book. But let's see what this year is, from 2005. So this is 16 years old. But again, if you're interested, that I would recommend that book as a way of sort of understanding what's going on. But there must be newer, better books that also cover this kind of topic. So what are we going to be talking about today? We're going to be talking about three major themes going in here. First, and this is always a weird one that I've always struggled with. Well, why do open source teams exist? You might think, well, that's a stupid question, but actually it's kind of important. Obviously, there are people who are writing all this code all over the world. But why? Why do they do it? What makes them do it? Because if you understand what makes them do it, then you are in a better position to provide incentives and to sort of maximize those motivations, right? If you are doing something wrong that's disincentivizing them, disincentivizing people to volunteer, you should stop doing that, right? But you have to understand the motivations to understand things that demotivate people. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Then we're going to talk about some issues of open source management, what types of things you want to have in place, what types of issues you should look at. I'm not going to dive into a lot of the details. It's going to be very broad. And then finally, we're going to talk about the development process and just sort of go over a little bit about how that works to kind of finish it out. Okay. Also, these slides are right here on the website. So if you want to download the slides, they're right there. And there's like probably, actually, I know there are 58 other presentations there and 87 videos of the presentations. So if you're wanting more, that would be a good place to go. Okay. Open source motivations. So this, again, I'm pulling from old material, but unfortunately, this is the only material I've been exposed to. It's an article from 2002 from the Register. There have been newer surveys. I think Black Duck did a survey, and I do reference that in one of my other presentations. But this is probably the best sort of description I've seen. Why do people volunteer for open source projects? And the odd part is there is not a single reason. It's the best example I could give you is if I ask somebody, why are you getting married? Odds are they're not going to give me a single answer. Right? I mean, they may give me a joke answer, right? That would be but usually things like this are pretty complicated. There's probably multiple motivations at work that drive somebody to get involved with the open source process. And if I go to individuals, even in the community right now, and I say, what is motivating you? Just tell me. They're really not going to be able to give me a single answer. They're probably going to say, I like the people I work with. I learn a lot from it. I like helping other people. I like the global nature of it. I like using the software. I like the success of it. So again, they're not going to give you a single answer. And we've broken it down into basically these four, major things that again are mentioned in that article. First is professional advancement. So the idea that you're going to learn new skills. You might have a boring job, and getting involved with open source is a way of sort of getting better, improving in your field. That actually was my number one motivation, probably for getting involved. Was that one in the mental simulation, which is number 3, and number 4 in a sense too. But again, even my story is not singular. So professional advancement, learning new skills is one reason. I had been working, but when 1996, at that point, I had been working for a company that wrote database applications for law firms. So financial reports, conflict of interest reports, expense recovery programs. After 7 years of that, you're not really growing a whole lot, right? So the idea here was that by getting involved with Postgres, I learned some new stuff. And my wife was also very kind of hesitant. Why are you spending time on this? And then she wanted me to get a master's or a doctorate in computer science. I had really no formal computer science training. Read a lot of good books though, computer books. And I said, I said, I'm not really good with, like, I don't know, classroom study for computers. I was better just learning on my own. I said, this is kind of a way of getting better skills for me than like going and getting, classes and stuff. And eventually it turned out to be really helpful. And frankly, I've been fully employed doing this for 21 years now. So kind of crazy. Um, Second reason that people get involved typically with open source is they have some practical need for the software. Either they have a business need for whatever enhancement they're working on, or the business wants the software to thrive and therefore is just working on whatever the community wants. But in both cases, you're working because you need the software. So you have a need for the software, either it's health or some specific need, and that's why you're working on it. The third one is mental stimulation, as I said before. Um, Software is kind of fun to work on, particularly in a group. And in a lot of cases, you learn a lot as you're talking to people about features and stuff. And finally, belief in open source, which is the idea that software should be open, software should be available to people, that I can make an impact on the world when I am involved in doing something in open source in a way that I can't in my company, or I can't if I'm just alone. And that's really true. A lot of even technology organizations, um, typically their technology people are in the background. Their executives are in the foreground. Their marketing people are maybe in the foreground, but their technical people are typically kind of in the back, right? But open source, we don't have any of that marketing management people. Everyone's in the front. All the developers are in the front. So you do a great thing in open source, you're going to be invited all over the world to give speeches, at least pre-COVID. You're going to be well known as somebody who, really made a difference to a lot of people. So, that's kind of cool. In terms of mental stimulation, which I want to kind of go into a little more, and this is actually from an even older book, Mythical Man Month, I believe from the 60s, by Frederick Brooks. And he basically said, what makes programming fun? Why is programming fun? And he basically explains it as it's the joy of making something in some kind of tractable medium, something that can be easily changed, right? And the joy of making something useful, solving puzzles, and learning new things. So again, this is sort of, I think, at some of the foundational reasons why open source works, aside from the practical of needing the software, or wanting to get a better career, or have believing in open source. The concept of sort of solving problems in a medium that is easily manipulated, particularly with other people, is actually really interesting. So that's the closest I found to kind of a motivational understanding of why open source is interesting. And again, if you understand that as a leader, then you're going to want to make sure that you're providing those opportunities to people, and you're not disincentivizing them by doing something different. Any questions?
Not after that slide. I think we're good
Yeah.
there.
Great, 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 great. Okay. So it's not all peaches and cream here. It's actually really hard. All right. So I've talked about why you can motivate people and how people get motivated. But how do you actually manage the people that you get? Because you may start with a very small team. When I started in 96, we had a couple dozen people, I'd say, who were really interested in helping with the project. and we've grown that obviously, exponentially over the years. And one of my primary goals is to continue to grow that. The trajectory of growth is most important. Not even where we are today, but how quickly are we growing in terms of adoption? How quickly we're growing in terms of developers, right? Because developers are kind of the engine that keeps Postgres relevant and continues to move it in new markets, which I have slides on in other presentations. But the idea of kind of bringing that all together is super important. But the challenges are pretty daunting. Communication obviously is the big one. You have people all over the world. You have people in all sorts of time zones. You have people with all sorts of languages and cultures. That is hard. It was hard. It was even harder pre-pandemic. We've gotten a little more used to it during the pandemic of doing virtual only conferences, virtual only communication. Now, I've worked from home since 93 or 92 or 94, something like that. So I'm used to this virtual thing where I don't see my boss for months and I don't go into an office and I have to stay motivated and I have to report on my progress on things on a daily basis and so forth. So I've gotten used to that, but most people aren't. They're used to just going to the office, doing some work, coming home, drinking some beer, watching sports, and then going back and doing it again, right? So you now have a different paradigm, and that whole virtual communication can be difficult. People, different time zones, cultures, again, languages, um, and you have no funding. Now, there are some of the open source projects that have funding. Postgres user groups have funding thanks to some money from Citus and actually a lot of contributions from a lot of companies over the years. But operational day to day, you don't have any funding. There's no revenue, there's no customers, there's no salaries, right? So all that kind of flies out the window and you have to kind of work with what you have. So if you approach open source as though it's a business, you're going to fail. Now, there are businesses who have open source projects, but they aren't open source groups. They aren't open source development. They're company development that gets distributed as open source. We're not talking about that. We're talking about pure open source projects like Linux or um, Apache, Postgres. All these are projects that don't really have any funding behind them. And they basically have to sort of get groups together. And it's a lot more similar to managing volunteers than it is to managing a business. So you have to kind of change that mindset of how you're doing things in open source. It's just different. So what communication methods are available? Well, we typically can't meet together, right? So in Postgres world, the typical communication is email. That doesn't have, you don't have to be email. You can use telephone. I used to call up people occasionally to talk about what they're doing. I still do. Um, I use instant messaging pretty extensively for one-to-one communication with people. And I'm going to stop right there and just look at those couple. Now the email one, that's pretty easy. Everyone kind of knows what that is, and you can email one person, you can email 1,000 people. The telephone instant messaging are pretty important because I find that individual communication with people that I'm interested in what they're doing is incredibly motivating. Um, Sending a mass email, is motivating to some level, but reaching out to individuals, I think, is incredibly powerful. So I often will do that. I have a chat thing with probably 150, 100 people in the community that I can reach out to pretty quickly. How you doing? What are you working on? I saw you had a problem with something. There was an email that I didn't understand. Can you help me with something? These things are pretty important because they show that you care about that individual. It's sort of an individual reaching out to you, sort of interested in what you're doing. Um, and I think that's really good. Group chat, we use IRC, we use Slack as well in the Postgres world. Those are often really useful. We have a wiki. There is, of course, Git and GitHub, and that whole collaborative source code bug report, problem report, push, cloning, push patches and stuff. which is very useful. And of course, conferences. Conferences often get overlooked. I originally overlooked conferences when I started as something that was not that interesting, as something that was just a lot, takes a lot of time to fly somewhere. And then, how many people am I going to talk to? 30 people maybe at a conference, right? And I'm going to fly all the way home. And I'm like, I can send an email out, thousands of people see it. Why am I going to go to a conference? Well, I typically go to 40 conferences a year. Even during COVID, I'm virtually attending roughly 40 conferences. Why do I do it? Right? Why am I here? It's because what I have found is that being in person or seeing somebody live um, has a different impact than just reading what they've written. When I went to OSCon years ago, Raleigh Open Source Conference years ago, 2000, I think, 2001, I basically went, I flew there, talked to 30 people, flew home, and I basically was like, that was a waste of time. I'm not going to do that again. But what they found is with 2 weeks later, I realized that Postgres was a lot more active the past 2 weeks. And the people I had eaten with at the conference were now much more active than they had been before the conference. So what actually helped was not me speaking to 30 people, but in a lot of ways, it was me just sitting and eating with people and talking to them about what I did. That motivated people. And we roll back to what I talked about motivation, right? What is motivating people to contribute to your project? And you could think it's some pie in the sky, we're going to solve world hunger kind of a of a message. But in a lot of times, it's sitting down, listening to somebody, talking to them, going to eat with them, walking the streets with them, laughing, telling a joke. Right? I tell a lot of weird jokes. A lot of times, that's what's motivating. So, when I typically before COVID, I traveled about 90, 95 days a year. That's about a quarter of the year. And why do I do that? Because when I go to Russia, when I go to China, when I go to Europe or Scandinavia or Latin America, um, Indonesia, it motivates people because I'm there to spend time with them. I'm here there to talk to them, there to get to know them. I'm not looking for them to do anything, right? I'm not there to say, hey, I want you to do X, Y, Z. That's not why I'm there. I am there just to be with them and to spend time with them and get to know them as people. Okay. And they start to understand that there is much more to this project than just the technology. It's actually the people that you're talking to. And the best description I've seen in regards to conferences is there's this thing called the hallway track. So when somebody's designing a conference, they're looking at, okay, we're gonna have this talk here and this top speaker there, and we're gonna have these tracks and so forth. But a lot of times when you walk out of a conference at the end of however many days it was, when you walk out at the end of this webinar, what's going to really stick with you? Is it going to be some technical topic? Maybe. Did you learn something new? Yeah. A lot of times it's sort of the people you met, it's the ideas you got, it's sort of the vibe you got from the group, it's how you made you feel, right? I mean, these are very nebulous things. But again, when you get back to motivation, you start to realize people say, yeah, this is a group I want to be part of. Yeah, this is somewhere I think is worth spending my time. I think I can learn something from these people. I think it may get me a better job someday. I think it might change me. And I gave one of our first Postgres conferences in 2006 in Toronto, and I got up to talk to everybody, and I said, and this is at that time Postgres we had been involved for 10 years, and I said, how many people's lives have been changed by Postgres? There's probably a group of 150 people. And I got a lot of nods, a lot of people, and a lot of people came up to me after and they said, until you said that, I didn't really understand how much Postgres had really done for me or changed who I was until you asked that question. Right. And I think that's powerful. That gets back to that motivation. And that gets back to the fundamentals of how you grow an open source group. It's not with technology prowess a lot of times. A lot of times it's a human touch and it's it's projecting a vision of who you are and what the team is that is tremendously powerful. Any questions?
Not from the group, but I have a question.
I sensed you had a question.
Yeah, I do. Um, why do you feel like sort of that human element is sometimes overlooked at these technical conferences and webinars and events?
That's a tremendous question. I think I have a good answer for it. So one of the things I've struggled with early on in the Postgres process back in the 90s, and I think we've overcome it to a large extent, but a lot of our early developers felt that they were developing software to develop software. Now, that might sound kind of funny, right? Don't you develop software to develop software? No, not really. You develop software to serve people. So we had a lot of engineers in the early days who were so focused on the software that they weren't really understanding how that software was going to impact or help our user base, right? So they would develop these incredibly elaborate features, that did A, B, C, D, E, F, but because there was no connection to how it would help users, it really didn't go anywhere. And there are some open source projects I think somehow have that problem still, that they're sort of developing it to develop it, right? They're not developing it for the user. So early on in the first years of, I used to often say, we're not developing this in a vacuum. We're not developing it just to play around. We're developing it to serve people. And if we don't focus on that, then effectively we're just sort of navel gazing and sort of we're playing with putty, but we're never actually firing it in the kiln and giving it to somebody, right? And it really just took an ethos of getting the communities to say, we're here to develop software. We're here to develop software for a purpose. And I think it gets back to the motivation slides that I have earlier, that a lot of people were the problem is they were so enjoying the development process themselves that they weren't understanding how that impacted other people. And for people who were in the project just for mental stimulation, that worked fine. They were happy to just develop software. But if you think of the other motivations, the career advancement, the idea of open source being a service to others, the idea of addressing company needs, right? If you just focus on, I'm going to develop software, it doesn't help. It's not addressing those other three needs that are in everyone, but the people may not know it. They may not have seen it in their lives. They may not have been part of what is possible. So they've grown up not understanding that we can do something that impacts the world. We can do something that's going to help a huge number of people. We can do something that's going to propel our software forward in a way that they never understood because they never worked at that level, Lindsay. So the reason that people don't understand that and is because they've never seen it in action, because they've never they just this what we're doing is not something that typically happens, right? So it's sort of like if I have to explain what I'm doing to somebody, it's tremendously hard. I can use all the words I want, but unless they can actually see it happen, they don't believe me. They think I'm just making up words. I mean, there's so many people who don't even understand the work I do. They don't get what I do. The way they get what I do is when they come to a conference with me and they see me talking to everybody and they see all the other companies who are talking to me and how we work together on stuff and how we talk about the project itself. They walk out of there and they say, yeah, now I get it. Right now I see what it is. But in a lot of sense, as a leader in an open source project, one of my goals is to bring out the best in people. So if you leave somebody, as a parent, certainly, if you leave somebody alone, they're going to kind of like fits and starts, get better and fail and so forth, right? But if you can help that child or help that adult even, right, to help show them what their strengths are and to channel them in a way that their strengths are going to be maximized, they're your friend forever, right? Because you've effectively helped them to become a better them in a way that would have been hard for them to do without somebody sort of kind of guiding them on how to become a better them. It may sound, patronizing or, whatever. My wife is always telling me what I do wrong, so I'm used to that. I tell my kids sometimes what they do wrong, and they're used to that. Um, but it's sort of this concept that now is popular in business. The concept of continual self-improvement, the concept of the continual evaluation. What am I doing well? What am I not doing well? Where are my strengths? Where can my strengths best be used? Right. And that's not going to happen in a vacuum. You have to have other people around to help you do that. And if I see a particularly difficult email conversation or see a conversation, in chat or even in person, and I think it's going in a bad direction, I'm going to talk privately to one of the people. Let's say, I saw that. I don't think that was the best way to go at it. I think you would have been much more effective to maybe do something else or try this other approach. I think it'd be much more, it would speak to that other person much better. And I think ultimately, I think that's what kind of works. um but everyone comes at a different skill level. I mean, there's people who can do engineering stuff that I can't do. I learned that early on. When I was in Philadelphia, I was, at these law firms, I was pretty big, like Momgen's here, something's good's going to happen, like an attitude. But when I started working with a global team, I realized, geez, there's like brilliant people that I can't even like consider. I don't even know why they're asking their questions, let alone try and answer their questions. They're so good. um but I have other skills and I can help them with theirs and they can help me, and it kind of works both ways. So I know it's a long answer, but people get kind of in a rut. They're good at one thing and they just want to continue doing that one thing. But they don't understand if they make a slight adjustment that what that one thing that they're good at can really be a much more powerful uh, instrument than they would imagine. Does that answer the question?
It absolutely does. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, this is not, that's why the topic of this talk is sort of, open source, leading open source teams. It's something that's very nebulous, something hard to quantify. I do go to leadership conferences twice a year. So I have heard other leaders speak, John Maxwell being probably one of the best I've ever heard, who talks about leading by example, who talks about a servant leader, who talks about the types of leaders we shouldn't be, who are ineffective, and the types of leaders who really motivate others to become the best of who they are. These are incredibly powerful concepts, not very technological concepts, but concepts nonetheless that are necessary to create a powerful open source team that's really, you know, running at its optimal instead of just limping along, which unfortunately a lot of open source projects kind of limp along, and that's unfortunate. Great. Okay. Um, just another obvious issue. Travel is incredibly expensive, and it's time consuming. So again, more we can do virtually, the better. That's why conferences work, because I typically can fly to one location and then see a whole bunch of people, and then in that same region, I can go to another event and then fly home. But it's not for everybody, and you're not going to create an open source team by trying to fly everywhere. It's just not going to work, and it's not going to work trying to get everybody to live in one city either. If that ship has sailed. You've got to find a way to do things virtually. Doesn't mean you don't do the in-person part, but you can't rely on in-person to be successful. I don't know of any open source team that relies on locality or constant travel to get people together physically that's going to be successful, because that whole concept in terms of time and expense are just going to drain any kind of forward motion that you have. Um, Time zone is another problem. You have to get used to 24-hour time zones. I used to, when I was working on a Windows port in, I guess, 2006, I had two people who helped me. One was in Sweden and one was in Australia. So I would wake up in the morning and I would talk to the Swedish person who had finished his work that day. So I would talk to him in his evening and I would work on stuff that he was working on. And then at night, I would work with the Australian person who liked to work in his morning before he went to work. Okay. I would pass messages between the Swedish guy in the morning and then the Australia guy at night. And then the next morning I would talk to the Swedish guy. And eventually it got worked. It got done, but it was weird because my day was really long, right? It was like 8 to midnight, a lot of days. Sometimes I'd have to sleep in the middle of the day to kind of balance out that schedule because nobody was awake in my middle of the day. The two people I needed were asleep, so or were at work. So yeah, it was kind of a weird. It was certainly a weird environment. But uh, you know, I got used to it, and it worked. But again, the idea of 9 to 5 or trying to, yeah, things are always happening. I wake up in the morning and I'm always get a deluge of activity, because all the Europeans have worked several hours before I get up, and I'm now having to catch up. And then I'll work past their day, and then when they wake up, they'll have to catch up for what happens in North America typically, or in Asia. Another aspect is culture. Cultures are different. So I've actually always been interested in culture. I've always been interested in traveling. I remember when I was in my teenage years, I used to listen to shortwave radio. You could hear, obviously, this is way before the internet, but you could hear radio shows from other countries. So I found that really interesting. Um, one of the one of the unusual things that I found as a US citizen is when I go to another country, not sort of trying to impose my style of doing things on them. So the concept of feeling like we have to be on time, or feeling like things have to be scheduled, or feeling like we can't just sit and relax for a while and so forth. I try to be very fluid and try to adjust to whatever the cultural norms are there. I will usually try and learn a couple words in the language, even if it's only three or four, so I can kind of at least converse simply. But also, you're going to have per culture teams. So you may have a Japan team, which kind of communicates a lot among themselves. You may have a Latin American team. You may have a Scandinavian team, or even German, UK teams, who kind of like to do things themselves. That's okay. You're not gonna change that. That's part of that whole motivation thing I talked about in the beginning. That what motivates people is going to be different. So that might be really for them, for the British guys, all to go to a pub every month and sort of sit and talk about what they're doing. That might speak to them in a way that wouldn't speak to me. So you want to encourage that kind of diversity, because that's what is motivating those people. Don't assume you're going to know what motivates them. You have to have your antenna out to figure out what motivates them and adjust to that. So for example, when I go to Japan, I'm going to behave a lot differently than I do if I'm in Russia, or if I'm in China even, because the style of doing things in all those countries is different. And the successful person is not going to try and be the same person in all those places. Language, another huge challenge. I feel bad that a lot of what we do is only in English, so you're kind of stuck there. I don't know if I would have been successful if I had to learn Russian to be involved in an open source project. I may have been able to learn Russian sufficiently. It may have been such a huge barrier that I never made it. I would have spit. I just would have never have gotten involved. I don't know, but I have to be sensitive that almost all these other countries are having to learn English to get involved with our project. And that's a tremendous hurdle. So whatever we can do to make that simpler for them, whether it's me going to their country and speaking very slowly and using very simple language, whether it's creating language specific chat channels or language specific conferences or documentation or email list, whatever we can do to bring people and reduce that barrier to involvement, we should do that. And I think we've been pretty successful with that in some of these. We do have a Spanish channel, I know a French channel, I believe. We have a whole Russian channels, I believe, on Telegram. We have per language conferences. We have per language email lists and so forth. So it is kind of nice. And finally, funding. You don't have any, so just get used to it. You have to work around it. Whether that's company sponsoring you, whether that's trying to figure out how to fly really cheaply and do a bunch of events at once, whether that's using free services, I don't know. But there's really very little you can do to change the mechanics of the funding problem. That's just a constraint you have to get around. Any questions?
None at this point.
Okay. So that was kind of the mechanics of what I want to talk about. Now I want to kind of finish up and kind of be specific about the development process. So what does it look like to do development? What are the forces of open source development that you really have to keep an eye on? The first thing is to involve everyone. I know, there's a sense that you've been working with this for years or maybe decades, and some new person shows up and has an idea, and you're like, really? Like this new person really, are they really, like they just showed up? Like, why are they going to have any idea that I haven't thought of? Well, that's usually that's going to be a failure, right? If you have that attitude, you're probably going to fail. I will give you an example. We had a person who showed up, I want to say it was about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, and said that our transaction semantics were slightly inaccurate and did not match the SQL standard. And obviously, we had the same transaction engine for, at that point, 20 years, and 25 years maybe. And you're kind of, this new person shows up and they're like, no, it doesn't, and he's explaining it in this incredibly complicated, way. And somebody says, no, you're misunderstanding. It works this way. And he's like, no, no, no. If I do this and this other thing happens. And he's like, no, 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 it's okay. It really does match the standard. And he's like, no, 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 really. And I'm reading this email thread again. It's probably 12 years ago. And I'm like, I said, everyone's everyone's saying this person's wrong, but he really sounds like he knows what he's talking about. Like he doesn't sound crazy, right? And I said, I'm gonna, and I thought I'm gonna spend, and this is part of the value of, I guess, having the opportunity to research stuff and not having deadlines, which typically I don't have, aside from needing to attend conferences and stuff like that. So I said, I'm going to dig into this report, the guy is saying. And he had this incredibly convoluted, example that he's trying to tell everyone this doesn't work right. I spent about 2.5 hours reading through the email, looking at it, looking at his example and stuff. And I was like, I said, if we take his example, we just simplify it and we just have 2 rows and we just do one and the other. I said, so I replied back on the thread and I said, I said, look at this example. I said, it's simpler than the one that this person originally reported. But I said, I think it is exactly explaining what he's saying. So as soon as I sent that email, everyone's like, oh, yeah, now I see it because it's so simple now. The person who reported it was Kevin Grittner, actually, who ended up writing our serializable snapshot transaction capability. Was explaining it just in a way that was maybe natural to him, but because we were new to it, we didn't make sense to us. But if we stripped it down to just a very simple case, you could see why the transaction semantics were kind of suboptimal and why you might want this special serializable mode that he ended up writing as for several years actually with another gentleman, Ash, out of I think Australia or New Zealand, who'd written a paper about how to do serializable snapshots. So what turned out, what came from an email from somebody we'd never heard of before, which everyone said really was inaccurate, came a great feature. So that's, I think, a great example, I think, of the fact that you can't write off anyone. Everyone typically has good ideas. You want to find out what motivates those people. Obviously, as I said before, if an individual feels like they're not being heard, reaching out to them as individuals sometimes can help to sort of say, I know that was hard email thread. I think maybe if we approach a different way, it might be more successful. Um, One of the things I've often said when I'm, talking about Postgres is that Postgres project is good at taking all the skills that everyone has involved in the project and sort of focusing it like a lens on the problem. So you have, thousands of people giving ideas and you have a lens, and that lens focuses it down to a single result. And I've seen that happen time again, where you work on a feature, somebody from one country has an idea, somebody from another country has a second idea, somebody else has a third idea, and you take all those ideas together, you kind of massage them to get them all to kind of work. You may discard one or two, but by the time you're done, you end up with a feature that's better than you could have produced and that any one of those three individuals could produce. Because again, you focus their skills like a lens on a problem, and you've created what's effectively a superior solution, and that's why people use your software, right? We're much better at that than companies. Companies are typically really bad at harvesting the intelligence. They assign people to very discrete tasks and they just say, go do it. We're much better at getting feedback and using that feedback to produce a superior result, superior feature, or superior outcome. And that's why open source is great. That's why open source is almost always superior to closed source software. And that's why open source is obviously growing so quickly. And obviously people work on, produce work that people can be proud of, because obviously at the end of the day, they're spending their time on this and they want to feel like um, there's value in their contribution and the time they've invested with your project to help improve it. Any questions?
No, sir.
Okay, great. So one of the things that I learned very early on is that nobody is paid to work on open source software. So that if the people can't understand your code, they can't work on it or they won't work on it. So in a commercial setting, if your code is terrible and you're paid to do it, you're going to have to work on it. You don't have a choice. But people have a choice with open source. So therefore, you have, as I said, people can't work on code if they can't easily understand it. So making that code easy to understand is actually really important. Long ago, I realized it was more useful for me to make the code easier for others to work on it than for me to work on it myself. I still do work on it. I still work on features, but effectively, if I see a way of making it easier for others, because there's thousands of others, I'm always better off spending my time there. That could be variable names. It could be auto indenting the code. It could be comments, a whole bunch of reasons. Whatever you can do to make that code easy to understand is going to pay huge dividends, because there's so many potential people who can work on it. And of course, quality documentation. Postgres is known for its quality documentation. Quality documentation is usually the touch point between the user and your software. They're going to go to the documentation first to understand how it works, typically before they're even going to use your software. So having documentation that is not an afterthought, where people can be proud of the documentation as well as the code, is, I think, getting back to what we talked about earlier, that we're not producing the code to produce the code, we're producing the code to be useful. And the code is not useful unless there's quality documentation to go with it. And finally, and this is sort of a summarization of what we talked about, we are, leading an open source team. You do not have authority. There's really no authority. Yes, I'm a core team member. Does that mean a whole lot in terms of whether my features get accepted? No. Does that mean a whole lot if I give an opinion on an email? Probably not. What does make an impact is how I lead by example and what I do and how I express myself and how I value others and how I promote others as well. So if I've been kind of surprised to the extent that I show good leadership and good leadership characteristics, those characteristics just naturally percolate to other people within the organization. So for example, when we're looking for members of the core team, which is sort of our sort of leadership team for complex problems, I'm not looking for the most technically capable person. In fact, technical capability is a minor issue for us. What we're looking for are people who have good judgment, who are wise, who understand how to motivate people, understand how to deal with complex problems, can be objective, okay, and people who have long-term investment in the project. Those are the kind of things we're looking at. Tech capability, it's kind of a nice to have, but we have a bunch of people with limited tech capability in the core team. That's fine. Um, because we're not looking for that. We're looking for people who are going to set the right kind of tone for the project, who can deal with some of the complicated non-technology problems that we deal with, and can be kind of examples for other people to emulate. Seeing value in other people's opinions, I already explained that before. Don't be surprised where new ideas come from. Accept failure gracefully. I have worked, this is a little too close to home, but starting in October of last year, I started working on sort of a TDE capability for Postgres. I probably got 60% of the way done. I had huge 100 email threads where people were making suggestions on how to improve my feature. I took a lot of that feedback and improved it. A whole bunch of other feedback I didn't use because I didn't think it was going in the right direction. But by the time June 1st came, which I guess was 7 months after I started, it was clear the community did not want to continue with the way I was working on the project. They wanted to take in a different direction. I didn't feel that direction was going to be successful. So I said, I just want to say up front, I think this is an important feature. I think the way I'm going at it is correct. But I now realize that there are other people who think we should go in a more complex direction. I don't think that's going to be successful. So unfortunately, I'm going to stop working on the project. But Monday, I think Monday this week, I sent an email and officially stopped. I sent my version of the patches and said, if anyone wants to work on it, feel free. But you're going to fail. You're going to fail. Having a tantrum about it, trying to bully people, getting upset about it is not helping anybody. You just say, well, I tried and I thought I did the right thing. Some people don't think it's the right thing. Maybe someday they will, but right now they don't. So I'm going to have to just pack it up and assume that those 7 months were failure. And that's okay. Maybe someday it'll be a success. But sort of crying about it is not going to help. And acting in a way that's disrespectful or selfish is definitely the wrong way to go. So, but it's hard. It's hard to be outvoted. It's hard to get rejected. It's hard to post a patch and see somebody find bugs in it. Humility is a huge thing for open source because it's like your brain is on the show. They're going to see every mistake you made, and somebody in Chile is going to say, this is wrong, and you're going to be like, why didn't I see that? Am I stupid? No, I'm not stupid. Because the person in Chile couldn't have wrote what I wrote, but they could see the flaw. And that's part of the process is your brain's out there for everyone to see the flaws, but when you succeed, they're out there to see the success as well. So, it's you got to pull up your pants and, take the hits. It's not fun, but you're on a global stage. So it just comes with the territory. As I said before, seek consensus. You have a whole bunch of people who are giving you ideas. Some of the ideas are very good. Some of the ideas may go too far. They may be going in the wrong direction. You have to have the wisdom to know when the ideas are good and take those and maybe adjust them. And then when they aren't good, you have to explain why they're not good in an objective way in a way that doesn't insult the other person and shows respect for that person. And that person may come back with an even better idea. You just never know, right? So it takes a lot of learning to see how to do that. And finally, don't be ruled by deadlines. Um, the whole "we got to ship it by Christmas" problem, we just don't have, and because it doesn't help anybody. We can't set deadlines. We don't control anyone. We don't control what anyone does. So the idea that we're going to somehow set a deadline and who's going to enforce that? Nobody. There's no enforcement. Enforcement's gone. That's It doesn't exist in open source. It's all consensus. It's all getting people to see where the project is best going. Very complicated, but ultimately the results are worth it. So thank you very much. I will take any questions you have. And I appreciate you kind of showing interest in this topic, which is a little unusual. But as you can see, there's quite a bit to it that isn't obvious at first glance.
Bruce, thank you so much. Yeah, I think this is a frequently overlooked topic. So, really, really pleased to have someone, especially someone with your experience, come on and speak to it. So, I'm not.
It feels like something that just happens, like that somehow you have a master plan that this is the way it's going to work. And that's not really the way it works, right? You just kind of stumble from day to day, and you eventually get upon a plan and a procedure that is successful. And then you basically build on that, over and over again. But you don't start out thinking, "Oh, I'm going to make this huge database. It's going to be hugely popular," and you just kind of go a day at a time. And because if the right motivations are in place and the right procedures are in place, then it kind of grows on its own.
Absolutely. So I'm not seeing any questions come in. So with that, I'm good to hang it up for the day. Bruce, thank you so much for this presentation. It's clear that you've put a lot of time into it, but also a lot of experience into these slides. So thank you, genuinely. And to all of our attendees, thank you so much for joining us. We are taking the month of July off, and I hope to see you back in August.